They thought she was just the quiet librarian, the one who shelved books, kept her head down, and lived a life without surprises. But on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, a man walked in with a gun, and in less than 10 seconds, she had it out of his hand. No one saw it coming, not the staff, not the patrons, and certainly not the armed robber. What no one knew was that Evelyn Hart's calm demeanor hid a past built on precision, discipline, and danger. How did she do it? And what happens when a small town discovers the quietest person in the room might also be the most dangerous? The library sat at the corner of Main and Willow, a brick structure whose walls had been standing for more than 100 years. Its exterior carried the soft erosion of time, the mortar between bricks faintly crumbled in places, the carved stone above the entrance worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. The front steps dipped slightly in the center where countless feet had passed, and the brass handle on the heavy wooden door bore the sheen of 1,000 hands. A single lamppost stood watch by the entrance, its glass globe clouded with age, casting a pale glow in the winter evenings when the rest of the street was already dark. Inside, the air always held a faint mix of paper, dust, and lemon-scented polish, a smell that regulars found oddly comforting. The floors creaked in familiar places, and the shelves, tall and narrow, rose like sentinels over the carpeted aisles. Overhead, arched windows let in the muted daylight, which pooled on the reading tables in oblong shapes that shifted slowly as the hours passed. A wall clock with a brass pendulum kept time with a quiet tick, each swing marking another moment of the day's quiet rhythm. The hum of the ancient heating system was a constant backdrop in winter, replaced in summer by the lazy turn of ceiling fans that stirred the still air without ever truly cooling it. The library was the kind of place where change happened slowly, if at all. Every morning at precisely 9 o'clock, the door unlocked, and the same small chorus of early patrons came in. Mrs. Daly, from 2 streets over, would head straight to the historical archives room, her bag already filled with notes for her never-finished family history project. Retired schoolteacher Harold Barnes claimed the same seat at the reading table nearest the windows, where he would unfold the town's only copy of the daily newspaper and read it front to back, without speaking to anyone. 2 young mothers, often with toddlers in tow, gravitated toward the children's section in the back corner, where low shelves and brightly colored mats made a small oasis of activity in the otherwise hushed building. That Evelyn Hart arrived earlier than all of them. The head librarian for nearly 15 years, she preferred to begin her day in the stillness before opening. When the building was empty and the faint echo of her own footsteps seemed louder, she moved with deliberate purpose, adjusting books that had been returned late the previous night, aligning them precisely with the edge of the shelf before scanning their spines. She checked the day's schedule, set out the book carts for the junior staff, and made sure the checkout desk's computer was ready. Nothing in her manner was hurried, yet she accomplished every task without wasted movement. She was not the sort of person who drew attention in a crowd. Of average height and slight build, she dressed in muted colors, soft grays, browns, and the occasional navy blue cardigan. Her dark hair, threaded with early silver, was always pulled back neatly, and she wore small round glasses that framed steady, unhurried eyes. Those who spoke to her found her polite, professional, and economical with words. To most people, she seemed like someone who had built her life on predictability and calm. That image suited her just fine. From the outside, her role was unremarkable. She managed book inventories, coordinated community reading programs, and ensured that the library remained a quiet refuge in the middle of town. She enforced the rules without raising her voice, her authority resting in the fact that no one could remember a time when she had been flustered. Even in moments when the children's corner became too loud or a patron argued over a late fee, Evelyn's response was the same: a measured tone, an unwavering gaze, and a solution that left no room for argument. The regular patrons had learned her patterns as much as she had learned theirs. They knew she paused every afternoon at 2 to water the potted plants by the windows, that she brewed a single cup of tea at 3 and drank it slowly while she reviewed the interlibrary loan requests. They knew she would help anyone find what they were looking for, but she never pried, never asked why. She moved through the day as if the library were an extension of herself, steady, orderly, and free of unnecessary noise. It was that very consistency that made her easy to overlook. She was part of the background, like the ticking clock or the hum of the heating system noticed only in her absence. Few in town wondered about her life beyond these walls, and fewer still had asked. Those who did received polite but brief answers, as if whatever had come before this life belonged firmly to the past. For most, Evelyn Hart was simply the quiet librarian on Main Street, and the library was the quiet place it had always been, and that was exactly how things were expected to remain. Evelyn Hart's life outside the library was much like the space she curated within its walls, structured, understated, and free from unnecessary clutter. She lived alone in a modest apartment 2 blocks away, in an aging brick building with ivy creeping along its outer walls. The single bedroom was sparsely furnished, a neatly made bed, a narrow desk by the window, and bookshelves that held not only literature, but volumes on subjects most people wouldn't expect: emergency medicine, crisis negotiation, self-defense manuals with creased spines and dog-eared pages. These were tucked among the novels and poetry collections, their presence explained to no one. Her mornings began quietly. At exactly 6:15, she would step onto her small balcony with a cup of black coffee, watching the town slowly wake. Delivery trucks rumbled along Main Street. The owner of the bakery across the road propped open his door to let out the heat from the ovens. A handful of early risers walked their dogs along the narrow sidewalks. Evelyn would observe it all in silence, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. At 6:30, she'd retreat inside, wash her mug, and move through her routine with the same unbroken precision she carried into her work. In the library, her presence was both constant and subtle. She was the first to arrive, unlocking the front door while the street was still empty, and the last to leave, ensuring each light was off and every door secure. The younger library assistants admired her efficiency, but often misread it as rigidity. They teased her in hushed tones when she wasn't around, joking about her military punctuality, though none of them knew how close their guess came to the truth. Evelyn never corrected them. She had long since learned that allowing others to underestimate her was its own form of control. The patrons knew her as calm and accommodating, yet unshakable when rules were tested. A teenager who tried to sneak out a book without checking it properly was met not with anger, but with a quiet firmness that made it clear such behavior wouldn't happen again. When arguments broke out over computer time limits, she settled them with measured logic, never raising her voice. There was an authority beneath her stillness, a gravity that discouraged further defiance. And yet, beneath that composed surface, Evelyn was acutely aware of how people saw her. The small-town familiarity bred a kind of complacency in others. They assumed she had lived her whole life here, that she had never done anything unexpected, never stepped outside this predictable orbit. A few younger patrons, emboldened by the library's hush and the absence of confrontation, sometimes made small jokes within her hearing. They commented on her old-fashioned clothes, the way she moved like she's floating, the slight stiffness in her left shoulder. She ignored them without so much as a flicker in her expression. Those who thought she didn't notice were wrong. Evelyn noticed everything. She knew which regulars read the paper without paying for it, who dog-eared pages instead of using bookmarks, and which staff members scrolled their phones behind the desk when they thought she wasn't looking. She noticed the subtle shifts in posture when someone lied, the way a person's breathing changed when they were anxious, and the slight tremor in hands that carried more weight than nervousness alone could explain. But her awareness was always tucked away, unannounced, just like the parts of her past she kept hidden. In truth, her quiet world was not born from fragility, but from deliberate choice. The life she had lived before this one had been filled with noise, urgency, and danger. Years ago, she had walked away from it, trading constant motion for deliberate stillness. The library was her sanctuary, a place where she could preserve that stillness and control the pace of her days. For Evelyn, blending into the background wasn't a symptom of weakness, it was a shield. And in a town that believed it knew everything about her, she was content to let the shield remain in place. That is, until the day it would be forced to drop. The library's silence was not always pure. Beneath the soft thud of books being reshelved and the low hum of the heating system, there were whispers, some light-hearted, some sharp, enough to cut. Evelyn had grown accustomed to them over the years. They came mostly from the younger assistants, students from the community college who worked part-time between classes. The whispers were never loud enough to disrupt the library's atmosphere, but they were not meant to be missed entirely. On slow afternoons, when the foot traffic dwindled and the weight of quiet pressed down, two of the assistants, Carla and Drew, would sometimes lean close behind the checkout counter, their voices low. "She moves like she's afraid to break something," Carla once murmured, her tone halfway between amusement and criticism. Drew smirked, glancing toward Evelyn as she adjusted a display of newly arrived novels. "Or like she's in some old black-and-white movie. It's kind of creepy." The words floated just far enough to reach her ears. Patrons, too, had their way of making judgments without asking questions. Some spoke of her fondly, admiring her efficiency. Others, particularly the high school students who came in to use the computers, treated her with the casual disrespect they reserved for people they thought held no power over them. "The ghost of the library," one boy whispered to another. Once, their laughter quick and stifled when she turned her head. They assumed her lack of reaction meant she hadn't heard. She heard everything. Evelyn had long ago trained herself to listen to what people said when they thought she was out of range. It was a habit from another life, one that had served her well. Still, she let their words slide off her without acknowledgement. She didn't correct them, didn't push back, didn't even allow the faintest twitch of expression to betray her awareness. That, she knew, was what unsettled them most. People expected a visible reaction: flustered denial, irritation, or even embarrassment. They didn't know how to interpret someone who gave them nothing at all. Her stillness, however, only fueled their curiosity. They speculated about her personal life with the same idle energy people used to discuss the weather. Some wondered if she'd always lived in this town. Others insisted she must have come from somewhere else because she didn't talk like a local. Carla once claimed she'd seen Evelyn leave the library in a long dark coat, walking briskly down the street without looking at anyone, like she was on some secret mission. Drew laughed it off, but later Evelyn noticed both of them watching her more closely when she locked up for the night. These undercurrents never disrupted the library's function. Books were still checked out, returns were logged, and programs for children and seniors went on without interruption. But the whispers had a way of shaping how people interacted with her. Some approached her with mild condescension, speaking slowly as though she might not understand. Others kept their distance, uneasy without knowing why. She let them think what they wanted. Occasionally, a patron would take their mockery further. Once, a man in his 20s came in late in the afternoon, looking for a specific book. When she told him it was unavailable, he smirked and said, "Figures, you look like someone who'd lock things away just to feel important." The comment rolled past her without acknowledgement, but she remembered his face and the restless energy in his hands. In her mind, she filed him under watch closely, the same way she categorized patrons who lingered too long without purpose. Evelyn understood that perception was a fragile thing. People believed what they could see, and all they saw in her was quiet routine. What they didn't see was the precision in her movements, the way she kept herself between vulnerable patrons and the entrance when a stranger came in, or the subtle habit of noting every hand that reached into a pocket or bag. They didn't notice how she instinctively kept her back to a wall during the monthly staff meetings, or how she could describe the layout of the entire building in detail, right down to the last emergency exit. The whispers were small things, carried on the breath of people who didn't know her and never tried to, but they formed a pattern, one that had followed her through years of this quiet life. It was a pattern she allowed to continue, because it kept her hidden. So long as they saw her as harmless, she could move unseen, her attention dismissed as nothing more than the habits of a fussy librarian. What no one realized, not Carla, not Drew, not the patrons who smirked behind their hands, was that Evelyn had no interest in changing their opinions. She knew the value of being underestimated. She had lived the consequences of being seen as a threat, and she had chosen, deliberately, to step out of that light. The whispers behind the shelves were not an injury to her pride. They were a kind of cover, and she wore them like armor. For now, before she became the librarian on Main Street, Evelyn Hart's life had moved at a different pace. It was not the measured rhythm of shelving books or cataloging returns. It was fast, sharp, and filled with the kind of urgency that didn't leave room for second guesses. There were no photographs from that time in her apartment, no certificates, no uniforms, no framed memories that might hint at where she had been or what she had done. To anyone who asked, she would say she had worked in security, offering no further details. That was the truth, but only in the way a shadow is the truth of the object it belongs to. Years earlier, long before the library, Evelyn had worn a uniform that commanded respect without a word. She had been part of a small, highly trained unit, tasked with protection and rapid response work that demanded not only skill, but precision under extreme pressure. Her days were spent in unpredictable environments, her nights in places where sleep came light and fractured. She had learned to read a room in seconds, to assess threats before they revealed themselves, to act decisively without waiting for orders. The smallest cue's posture, breathing, eye movement could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. She had been good at it. Too good, maybe. That world had a way of drawing more from a person than it ever gave back. It eroded softness, replacing it with vigilance that never quite faded. By the time she left, her reflexes were still sharp, but the cost of keeping them had begun to show in ways she didn't speak about. Her departure was not marked by ceremony or farewell gatherings. It was a quiet exit, the kind she had always preferred. When she came to the town on Main Street, she sought a place where nothing urgent would demand her attention. The library had been that place. She liked the symmetry of the shelves, the order of the cataloging system, the way books waited patiently for the next reader. Here, nothing chased her. She could breathe at her own pace, answer questions about biographies and novels, instead of tactical plans and exit routes. Over time, the tension in her shoulders eased, but it never disappeared entirely. There were still small tells of who she had been, the way she positioned herself so she could see both the front entrance and the emergency exit while working at the circulation desk, the way she instinctively moved between a patron and the door when someone unfamiliar entered with too much force. Even the younger assistants, who thought of her as fragile, occasionally remarked on her uncanny ability to appear exactly where she was needed before anyone called her name. Every so often, someone from her past would find her, though not many knew where to look. A letter once arrived, unmarked except for her name. She had read it at her kitchen table and burned it in the sink without a second thought. On another occasion, she spotted a familiar face at the far end of the grocery store. Isla, former colleague who had given her a nod of recognition but hadn't approached. Encounters like that reminded her that while she had left that life, it had not entirely left her. She never told her co-workers about those moments. To them, she was a constant calm, predictable, perfectly suited to a life measured in due dates and shelving schedules. They didn't know that her quiet was not simply a personality trait but a discipline, honed over years of needing to remain still until the exact right moment to move. Evelyn never spoke about why she had walked away from her old life. There were stories she could tell, but doing so would invite questions she had no interest in answering. The people here didn't need to know about the narrow alleys in cities half a world away, or the weight of an armored vest on humid nights. They didn't need to know how many times she had stood at the edge of danger and chosen to step forward. The library was the present. The past remained in a locked room in her mind. Its door marked no entry, and if anyone were to ask, she would smile politely, adjust her glasses, and change the subject. Some histories were better left between the person who lived them and the silence that followed. Wednesdays in the library carried a distinct rhythm, a kind of predictable midweek lull that Evelyn had come to expect. By early afternoon, the morning rush of retirees and researchers had thinned out, replaced by a steady trickle of patrons whose reasons for visiting were as varied as their appearances. The front door, with its heavy brass handle, would creak open every few minutes, letting in bursts of outside air, cool in the winter, warm and dusty in the summer, before settling back into stillness. The regulars were easy to spot. There was Mr. Callahan, an older man with a worn leather satchel that had been patched. So many times it was more repair than original material. He made a slow circuit through the history section every Wednesday, pulling out books on Civil War battles and naval strategies, before settling into his usual corner. Across the room, at one of the long tables under the arched windows, high school students sprawled with textbooks and notebooks, earbuds in, pretending to study while they traded whispered jokes. Their laughter would rise just above an acceptable volume, prompting Evelyn to drift near their table until they noticed her presence and lowered their voices again. Parents with small children tended to congregate in the back corner, where low shelves and bright rugs created a contained chaos. On Wednesdays, the children's librarian ran a story and craft hour, which filled the space with the sound of paper being cut, markers squeaking across pages, and the occasional delighted shriek when glitter glue made an appearance. Evelyn, though not directly involved, often passed through to ensure supplies were restocked and to retrieve any stray books that had wandered from their shelves. Then there were the quiet ones, people who came in alone, their visits marked by silence and focus. Some read newspapers, others browsed the fiction aisles with a deliberate pace, fingertips brushing spines as they walked. Evelyn always noticed them, particularly the ones who avoided interaction altogether. She respected their desire for privacy, but she also filed away their patterns in her mind. The man in the grey coat, who came every Wednesday at exactly 2:15. The young woman who always chose a seat near the back, with her laptop angled, so no one could see her screen. Wednesdays also brought in a small group from the nearby community center. Adults with special needs accompanied by their program coordinator. They spent time looking through large print, picture books and magazines, occasionally asking Evelyn for help finding a title. She greeted them warmly, her voice softening in a way that was noticeable to anyone paying attention. Between all these comings and goings, the library maintained its hummer, layered, quiet, filled with the faint rustle of turning pages, the muffled thud of books being returned to shelves, and the low murmur of conversations too subdued to make out. Evelyn moved through it like a conductor, keeping time, adjusting displays, answering questions, and making subtle corrections when something was out of place. The junior staff often used this slower part of the day to catch up on reshelving and cataloging returns. They would chat in low tones behind the circulation desk, sometimes glancing toward Evelyn to see if she was listening. She was always listening, though she gave no sign of it. On occasion, their conversation would shift to local gossip. Who was seen where, which shop on Main Street was rumored to be closing. Evelyn tuned it out, unless the tone of their voices changed into something sharper, the kind of whispering that carried an edge. By 3 o'clock, the library settled into a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Light from the tall windows shifted toward gold, casting long, thin shadows between the shelves. Evelyn would make her way to the front desk for her afternoon tea, keeping one eye on the entrance as the door opened for the next patron. On most Wednesdays, that patron would be a regular, a familiar face. But she also knew that the predictable flow could be disrupted in a heartbeat. She had learned long ago that even the most ordinary moments could turn without warning, and that knowledge, kept quietly in the back of her mind, was why she never let herself grow complacent. It was just after 2:30 when the door's brass handle turned and the weighty-wood swung inward with a groan. The sound wasn't unusual. People came and went all day, but something in the timing made Evelyn look up from the stack of returns she was checking in. Wednesdays had a rhythm, and this entry didn't fit it. Most of the usual patrons for that hour were already settled into their corners. This man was new. He stepped inside with a slow, deliberate pace, as if measuring the room. The winter air clung to him, carrying the faint scent of cold metal and gasoline. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his forehead and gloves that seemed too thick for the mild chill outside. His jeans were worn but not torn, his boots scuffed but solid. There was nothing overtly remarkable in his clothing, yet Evelyn's eyes caught on the shape beneath the front of his jaqueta, slight protrusion near the waistband that didn't match the natural lines of his body. He didn't head for the shelves or the reading tables. Instead, he lingered just past the entrance, his gaze sweeping the room. Not scanning for books, scanning for people. Evelyn recognized the difference instantly. The way his eyes moved from the front desk to the patrons, lingering on the circulation counter where the donation box sat. She had seen this pattern before, years ago, in very different places. The man's posture was loose, almost casual, but the looseness was calculated. His shoulders were slightly forward, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, as if ready to shift quickly. He was neither browsing nor lost. He was making a decision. Evelyn set the returned books aside and glanced toward the junior assistant behind the desk, who was obliviously typing on the computer. From her position, Evelyn could see every patron in the library. Mr. Callahan was in his usual corner with a stack of history books. The high school students were still gathered at their table, their laughter dimmed to a low hum. The story hour in the children's section had just ended, and a mother was helping her toddler back into a coat. None of them noticed the man began to move toward the desk, his gaze cutting briefly to the front windows as though noting the angle of the light. His right hand dipped into his hoodie pocket, not deep enough to be searching for something small like a wallet, but deep enough that the edge of his arm pressed against the shape at his waist. Evelyn kept her breathing steady. She didn't step forward immediately. In her training years ago, she had learned the value of stillness in the moments before action. Her right hand rested lightly on the desk, her eyes on the man but not fixed in a way that would alert him she was watching. She let him think she was just another quiet librarian behind her desk, minding her own work. The junior assistant finally looked up and greeted him, but the man didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward the donation box again. Evelyn noted that the position of his feet, tangled slightly toward the desk now, his right shoulder forward. That was the tell. Her mind began cataloging distances, from him to the desk, from her to him, from the desk to the nearest patron. She measured it without conscious effort, her awareness tightening around him like a narrowing circle. To anyone else, it was just another patron entering the library. But Evelyn knew the feel of a room shifting. Something had just crossed the invisible line between ordinary and dangerous. She adjusted her glasses, her voice calm when she addressed him for the first time. "Can I help you find something?" That man's eyes met hers for the briefest moment before darting away. His jaw tightened. That was all she needed to know. The air in the library seemed to shift as soon as he avoided her gaze. It wasn't visible to anyone else. No one turned their head. No chairs scraped back. But Evelyn felt it, the way a sailor feels a change in the wind before a storm. She'd learned to trust that instinct years ago, when hesitation could mean the difference between control and chaos. The man didn't answer her question. Instead, he drifted a few steps closer to the desk, his movements slow but with an undercurrent of intent. His left hand stayed free at his side, but his right hand remained buried in the hoodie pocket, and the angle of his arm hadn't changed. His eyes swept the room again, quick, shallow glances that didn't linger on the bookshelves or the high windows, only on the people. Evelyn took in the details without breaking her calm exterior. The man's breathing was slightly faster than normal for someone just walking in from the cold. His lips pressed together, then parted in the kind of half-breath that suggested he was talking himself into something. His stance widened subtly, feet planted for stability. None of these things, alone, would have been enough. Together, they formed a picture she'd seen before. Behind the desk, the junior assistant, Drew, seemed oblivious, still seated and clicking through the computer's catalog system. The donation box, a clear acrylic container filled with small bills and coins, sat directly in front of him. Evelyn could almost see the path forming in the man's mind. Approach the desk, use intimidation to control the staff, grab the cash, and get out before anyone reacted. But this wasn't a grocery store checkout or a gas station counter. The library's space worked against him in ways he probably hadn't considered. The shelves formed natural choke points. The tables created barriers, and the distance from the front door to the desk left him exposed for longer than most would be comfortable with. Evelyn noted it all without moving. In the far corner, Mr. Callahan turned a page in his history book. Oblivious, the high school students were still laughing quietly, unaware. A mother zipped her toddler's coat, humming under her breath. It struck Evelyn how quickly their calm could fracture, how one sudden movement could pull the whole room into panic. She had seen that chain reaction before. The widening eyes, the sharp intake of breath, the frozen seconds before chaos erupted. The man took another step forward. This time, his gaze locked on Drew. His jaw shifted, the muscles in his cheek tightening. Evelyn saw his right shoulder drop slightly, a movement that could mean he was adjusting his grip on whatever was in his pocket. Her mind began breaking down the space into a mental map. Between them lay less than 10 feet, and to her left, the nearest solid cover, was the end of a bookshelf. The weapon, if it was one, was still concealed, which meant she had time to decide how to act. Drawing attention to him too early could escalate the situation before she was in position. Waiting too long risked losing control of it entirely. She took a slow breath, then moved casually toward the front counter, carrying a small stack of returned books. From the outside, it was an ordinary task, but it brought her closer to the man's line of movement. She set the books down gently, never taking her eyes completely off him. "Afternoon," she said, her tone light but steady. "You looking for the reference section?" He didn't answer. His gaze flicked to her for just a second, long enough for her to read the tension in his expression. This wasn't the look of someone in a hurry to leave with a book under his arm. This was the look of someone bracing to act. Evelyn knew she was no longer simply the quiet librarian behind the desk. In that moment, she was something else entirely, someone who had been here before, in 100 other rooms, facing 100 other strangers who carried the same electric stillness before a break. The first signs of trouble weren't whispers. Now, they were right in front of her, sharp and clear, and she was ready for them. It happened with no warning, the way these moments often do. 1 second, the man was standing a few feet from the desk, his hand buried in his hoodie pocket. The next, the motion was sharp and deliberate. His right arm came up, and the dull gleam of metal caught the light from the tall front windows. A gun not waved wildly, but held steady in a grip that told Evelyn he'd handled it before. "Don't move," he said, his voice low but cutting through the stillness of the library. He gestured at Drew with the barrel. "Open that box. Now." The sound of the mother's voice in the children's section stopped mid-home. The laughter from the high school students went silent. Even the steady flipping of Mr. Callahan's history book froze in place. In less than a breath, the library's gentle hum collapsed into complete stillness. Drew blinked, his hands hovering over the computer keyboard. "Sir, this is don't talk." The man snapped. "Open it. Put the cash on the counter." His tone was sharp, but not frantic. That steadiness was almost more dangerous than a trembling hand. Fear could make someone unpredictable, but confidence meant he thought he was in control. Evelyn's eyes locked on his "There are children here," she said evenly. "I said don't talk," he growled, shifting his aim slightly toward her. The movement gave her a clearer look. At his stance, left foot forward, weight slightly on the back leg, shoulders set. His grip was firm but not rigid. He wasn't bluffing. Behind her, she could hear the faint rustle of movement as the mother in the children's section began to gather her things, trying to make herself small as she pulled her child closer. Evelyn didn't turn. Every inch of her focus was on the man, noting the way his eyes darted from her to the donation box, back to her again. "Now," he barked at Drew. The young assistant's fingers fumbled with the latch on the acrylic box. The sound of coins shifting inside seemed unnaturally loud. Evelyn could see his breathing quicken, his shoulders rising and falling too fast. She stepped slightly closer to the counter, making the movement look like she was simply positioning herself between Drew and the man. "You don't want to do this here," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't pleading, it was measured, deliberate, the kind of tone that didn't challenge directly but still carried weight. "I said shut up." His voice cracked this time, just slightly. That tiny break was a crack in his composure, and Evelyn noted it. His left foot shifted back half an inch, not retreating, but rebalancing. The high school students near the windows were frozen in place, their eyes wide. One of them slowly reached for his phone, but Evelyn gave the faintest shake of her head. It was enough to make him stop. The bills from the donation box began to pile on the counter in front of Drew. The man's eyes followed them, his attention narrowing. That focus was dangerous, but it was also a momentous sliver of time when his awareness wasn't at its widest. Evelyn let her breathing slow. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the desk, her stance shifting just enough to feel the ground beneath her in a balanced way. She didn't look at the gun directly. She kept her gaze on his face, reading every flicker in his expression. "You're almost done," she said, her tone calm enough to sound out of place in the tension. "Take what you want and walk out the door." He glanced at her again, suspicion in his eyes. "Why are you so calm?" he asked, his voice tight. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was, this wasn't the first time she had been on the wrong side of a gun, and she knew exactly how many seconds she needed to change the balance of power. All she had to do was wait for the right one. The gun didn't bother her in the way it was meant to. Evelyn knew the danger was real. She could read the confidence in the man's grip, the calculated angle of his stance, but fear had no place. In her thinking, stillness had been her companion in moments far worse than this, and it wrapped around her now like a familiar coat. She stayed where she was, the desk at her hip, her feet set in a way that kept her balanced but unthreatening. Her hands were visible, resting lightly on the edge of the counter, fingers relaxed. She made no sudden moves, no sharp gestures that might startle him. Control wasn't about overpowering someone, it was about guiding the space until it belonged to you. The man was watching her now, not just the box of bills on the counter. Something in her composure was unsettling him. She could see it in the quick flicker of his eyes. People expected fear. They drew strength from it. When it wasn't there, it forced them to wonder what they were missing. Drew was still fumbling with the last of the bills, his movements jerky and uneven. Evelyn could see the tremor in his hands. "Hurry up," the man barked, but the edge in his voice was sharper this time. The crack in his composure was widening. In the corner, Mr. Callahan slowly lowered his book, his eyes fixed on the scene. The high school students hadn't moved, their faces pale and still. The mother in the children's section was holding her toddler tight, her gaze darting toward the nearest exit. The room's quiet had deepened into something heavy, expectant, like the air before a lightning strike. Evelyn's breathing stayed even. She let her focus narrow until the man and the weapon were the only things in her awareness. She could see the faint sheen of sweat on his temple, the way his right thumb flexed unconsciously against the grip. She noted the small twitch in his left eyelid, a sign of strain. All of it told her the same thing: he was still in control, but not as much as he wanted to be. She shifted her weight slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but he saw it. His eyes snapped to her feet, then back to her face. "Don't move," he warned. "I'm not," she said calmly. "You've got what you came for." Her tone was even, not confrontational, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone who wasn't pleading. It wasn't a challenge, it was a statement of fact. The steadiness in her voice was beginning to work on him. She could see it. His jaw tightened, but his breathing sped up by half a beat. He wasn't sure anymore if he was steering the situation. She had shifted the balance just enough to put doubt in his mind. Drew stacked the last few bills on the counter. The man's attention flicked to the money, then back to her. That glance was important. It told her how much his awareness was fragmenting. Each time his eyes left hers, it created a gap. Evelyn didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch, the seconds growing longer in his head. People under pressure often mistook silence for inaction, but she knew better. Silence could be a weight, pressing down until the other person had to make a move, sometimes the wrong one. She could feel the moment approaching. It wasn't here yet, but it was close. His stance had shifted, the weight in his knees no longer evenly distributed. His left shoulder had dropped just slightly, the barrel of the gun lowering by a fraction. When it came, she would know, and when it came, she wouldn't waste a breath. The quiet inside the library had thickened to something almost physical. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, as if even the smallest sound might tip the balance in the wrong direction. The faint hum of the heating system, the muted creak of the old building settling these noises that usually faded into the background, now seemed magnified, each one marking the slow, heavy passing of seconds. The man's eyes moved restlessly, but his body stayed anchored in place. He kept glancing toward the front door, as though calculating how long it would take him to get outside, but each glance was quick, wary. Evelyn knew that was good. It meant he didn't trust the path out. Trust was what made people careless. She kept her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly on the counter, her feet positioned in a balanced stance. She didn't blink more than she needed to, and she kept her breathing slow and visible, letting him see the rise and fall of her chest. It was deliberate. People mirrored what they saw, and if she could pull him even slightly into her pace, she could slow him down without him realizing it. The donation money lay in a small stack on the counter. Drew's hands hovered near it, his fingers twitching like he wanted to push it closer, but wasn't sure if that would help or provoke him. Evelyn gave the faintest shake of her head, barely enough to be seen, and Drew froze. The robber didn't notice. His focus was drifting in small, uneven bursts. In the back corner, the mother with the toddler was now crouched behind a low shelf, holding her child close, whispering softly in a rhythm meant to keep the child quiet. The high school students hadn't moved, their eyes locked on the man. Mr. Callahan's large hands were still resting on his open book, but Evelyn caught the way his eyes flickered to the man's back, assessing, the way someone does when imagining what they might do if they had to. The silence worked differently on each person. For most, it was a prison, locking them in place. For Evelyn, it was a tool. She'd been trained in how to make the moments between words do the work of the words themselves. Each time the man said nothing, each time his own voice faded into the stillness, the edges of his authority softened. "You've got what you came for," Evelyn said again, her voice barely above the hum of the heater. She didn't move toward him, didn't make it sound like a challenge. It was just there, in the air, the same as the quiet. He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "Why aren't you scared?" She didn't answer right away. She let the question hang there, unanswered, until the silence wrapped around it like a shroud. Then she said, "Because fear won't change what happens next." That made him shift his weight. A small thing, but important. His right foot slid back half an inch, and the muzzle of the gun dipped again, just slightly. His breathing changed, more shallow now, Evelyn recognized the signs. He was caught between the urge to get out and the need to assert himself. That conflict was where mistakes were born. From somewhere behind her, a chair creaked as one of the students adjusted their position. Sound made the man's eyes dart for just a second, and when they came back to her, there was a trace of something else there, uncertainty. The silence pressed in again, heavier now, the kind that made people act just to break it. Evelyn knew it wouldn't hold much longer. The weight of it was bending the moment toward something, and soon, one of them would have to move first. She was ready for it to be her dot. Evelyn had counted the distance the moment the man stepped inside. From where she stood at the counter to where he held the gun, there were maybe 9 feet between them. 9 feet was too far too close without being noticed if she rushed but 3 slow, deliberate steps could cut that distance nearly in half without setting off alarms in his head. She'd used that principle before, in rooms far noisier than this one, with people far more desperate than the man in front of her. The first step was easy. She let it happen in the middle of a small shift in her posture, as though she was simply adjusting her stance to lean closer to the counter. Her weight moved forward onto her left foot, the distance between them closing by less than a yard. His eyes flicked toward her feet, then back to her face. But the movement was so slight, he let it pass. The second step took patience. She waited for him to glance at the front door again, his attention split between what was behind him and what was in front of him. When his eyes went to the windows, she slid her right foot forward, planting it carefully, making no sound against the carpet. She kept her shoulders level, her breathing steady. To anyone else in the room, it might have looked like she hadn't moved at all. The third step was the most dangerous. It brought her into the range where every twitch of his hand mattered, where the wrong angle could put the barrel directly in her face. She waited for the smallest window, drew shifting slightly behind the desk. The rustle of the mother's coat in the children's section pulling the man's attention just for a heartbeat. Evelyn stepped forward, slow and controlled, her balance perfect. Now she was close enough to see the details of the gun-black polymer frame, compact model, well maintained. His trigger finger rested along the side rather than inside the guard, which told her he had at least some training. But the small tremor in his forearm said he wasn't immune to the strain of holding people at gunpoint. Every second stretched that strain tighter. Her voice stayed level. "You need to think about your next move," she said, just loud enough for him to hear over the hum of the heater. She kept her hands still, giving him no sudden cues to react to. He glared at her. "My next move is walking out that door with this money. Then you're going to have to turn your back on all of us," she replied, her tone even unhurried. "You sure that's a good idea?" He hesitated. The pause was brief, but it was there. His eyes darted around the room again, and his left foot shifted just a fraction, but enough for her to note how his stance was changing. His attention was stretching thin, and thin attention left openings. Evelyn could feel her center of gravity settle, her muscles aligning in readiness, without showing a hint of tension. 3 steps had brought her within striking range. She didn't need to move yet, but now she could if she had to. The space between them was narrow enough for precision, wide enough for safety. Around them, the library remained frozen, the other patrons locked in their own stillness. No one spoke, no one moved. The moment was balanced on the edge of a blade, and Evelyn knew she was the one deciding which way it would tip. She let another breath pass, slow and measured, her eyes steady on his. She didn't need to look at the gun now, she could read it in his posture, in the line of his arm. One wrong thought from him, one flicker of movement, and she was ready to end it. The first part of controlling a threat was getting close enough to act. The second was making sure they didn't realize how close you already were. She'd just finished the first. Now it was time to wait for the signal to start the second. The signal came in something so small that no one else in the room would have noticed. The man's eyes darted toward the mother in the children's section, the motion of her adjusting her child's coat pulling his focus for less than a second, but it was enough. In that heartbeat, the barrel of the gun dipped just a fraction lower, and his wrist loosened under the weight. Evelyn's mind registered it the way a musician hears a cue in a piece of music. They didn't have to think about it, they just moved. Her first action wasn't dramatic. She stepped in, closing the last of the space between them in one smooth motion, her hands already lifting from the counter. Her right hand came up, palm open, sliding along the outside of his wrist in a firm, controlled sweep. She didn't grabbing, invited resistance. Instead, she redirected, guiding the barrel away from the center of the room, in a curve that felt to him like his own movement. The change was subtle enough that no one gasped, no one screamed, but Drew's eyes widened as he realized the gun was no longer pointing at him. Evelyn's voice stayed calm, almost conversational. "Easy," she said, her tone carrying the authority of someone who was not asking for permission. The man reacted. Of course. His head snapped toward her, confusion flashing across his face at how quickly she had shifted the geometry of the moment. His first instinct was to pull back, to reclaim the space he'd lost, but Evelyn didn't fight that motion head-on. She let his arm retreat, using the momentum to pivot his wrist further outward, keeping the muzzle angled toward the carpet. It was a technique drilled into her years, a go redirect, don't resist. The human body tended to push harder against opposition, but when its force was turned into an arc, the mind lost the sense of control. The man's balance shifted without him realizing it, his weight now slightly over his heels instead of his toes. Evelyn noted it instantly. The rest of the room hadn't moved, but she could feel the change in the air. The high school students were frozen, eyes wide. Mr. Callahan's knuckles had whitened around his book. The mother was now crouched fully behind the shelf with her child, her gaze locked on the two figures at the center of the library. Evelyn's left hand came up, not to touch the gun but to press lightly against the man's forearm, reinforcing the angle she'd created. He was still holding the weapon, but it no longer commanded the space. Every inch it traveled from here would be on her terms. The man's mouth opened, but whatever he was about to say caught in his throat. His eyes flickered downward to the weapon, then back to her face, as if trying to reconcile how the quiet woman behind the desk had suddenly become the one steering the moment. "This isn't going to go the way you think," she told him, her voice low enough that it was meant for him alone. He tried to wrench his arm back, a sudden sharp movement meant to break contact, but Evelyn moved with it, stepping closer instead of away. Her right hand slid slightly higher on his wrist, her thumb pressing against a nerve, just enough to send a jolt of discomfort into his grip. Not enough to make him drop the gun yet, but enough to shift his attention from offense to defense. Now, they were connected in a way that went beyond the physical. The stillness in her was the exact opposite of the tension in him, and she knew that in these moments, the one who stayed calmer almost always prevailed. Move one had done its job. The gun was no longer a fixed point in the room, no longer the anchor for everyone's fear. It was moving under her guidance hand with each inch. The man's control over the situation was slipping. The moment the man's balance tipped back onto his heels, Evelyn knew she had her opening. In close quarters, imbalance was as dangerous to a threat as any weapon. She didn't need to overpower him, she needed to make him react before he could think. Her left elbow came up in a tight, controlled motion, not swinging wide like a strike, but driving directly into the crook of his forearm. The point of her elbow met the inside of his arm with just enough force to disrupt the muscles that kept his grip steady. Pain radiated from the impact, and she felt his wrist jerk slightly in response. It wasn't enough to make him drop the gun immediately, but the angle of the weapon sagged further toward the floor. The man hissed between his teeth, trying to bring his arm back up, but Evelyn stayed close, stepping in to smother his movement. In a confined space, distance was the enemy giving him. Room would let him reset his stance, maybe even raise the muzzle again. Instead, she pressed the advantage of proximity to anyone watching. It didn't look like much. The quiet librarian, body close to the man's side, one elbow driving in while the other hand maintained control of the wrist. But for the man holding the gun, it was a sequence of small, precise disruptions, each one stacking on the last, making it harder for him to regain control. She kept her voice calm, almost conversational. "Let go." His response was a growl, of frustration, his free hand twitching as if he was deciding whether to try to grab her or shove her away, but he hesitated. That pause told her what she needed to know. He wasn't fully committed anymore. Doubt had entered the space between them. Behind her, she could hear the creak of a chair, a shuffle of movement from one of the tables. The other patrons were still frozen, but the tension in the room had shifted. Fear was still there, but it was mingling with something else now, hope. The man tried to step back, pulling his arm toward his chest to protect it, but Evelyn followed, staying inside his reach. She felt the muscles in his forearm tighten under her grip, the telltale sign of someone trying to reassert control. That was when she shifted her weight forward, using her shoulder to bump into his. forcing his upper body slightly offline. The combination was subtle but effective. His center of gravity moved even further back, and his stance weakened. His knees bent slightly as he tried to steady himself, which gave her the perfect moment to reinforce her elbow pressure. The joint in his arm locked awkwardly, limiting his ability to keep the gun raised. She could feel his breathing change shorter, now, with the rhythm of someone realizing they were losing ground. That realization was often more powerful than pain in forcing a decision. "Don't make this harder," she said, still level, still steady. Her tone wasn't threatening. It was inevitable. He clenched his jaw, eyes darting toward the front door, as if calculating whether to break away and run. But that thought was already too late. Her positioning and control had cut off his momentum. Move 2 wasn't about disarming yet. It was about setting the stage, taking away the confidence in his grip, robbing him of the stance and leverage he needed to use the weapon. By the time he realized his control was slipping, Evelyn was already in position for the final step. The gun was still in his hand, but it no longer owned the moment. She did. The man's grip was still tight, but tightness had its own weakness. When someone held on too hard, their control came from tension, not balance, and tension could be turned against them. Evelyn felt the shift in his forearm, the way the tendons strained under her fingers, and she knew it was time. She didn't yank. Yanking made people fight back harder. Instead, she rotated her wrist over his, pivoting her thumb against the sensitive spot just above the base of his palm. At the same time, her other hand guided the muzzle in a small, sharp arc toward the floor. The movement compressed his wrist in a way that his hand couldn't fight without pain, and the angle of the weapon became impossible to maintain. There was a soft clatter of metal against carpet as the gun slipped free. Evelyn didn't watch it fall. Her foot was already moving, sliding it across the floor with the inside of her shoe until it stopped halfway under the desk, well out of his reach. She had learned long ago that disarming was only half the battle. Securing the weapon was just as critical. The man's first instinct was to lunge after it, but Evelyn's shoulder was already pressed into his chest, redirecting his momentum sideways. The movement wasn't aggressive enough to knock him down. She didn't want to escalate to that unless she had to, but it broke the line between him and the weapon completely. His balance wavered again, and for the first time since he'd walked in, his hands were empty. The room's stillness cracked. A sharp inhale from Drew, the squeak of a chair as one of the students half rose to their feet. The mother in the children's section clutched her child tighter, but her eyes were locked on Evelyn now, not the man. Evelyn kept her tone even. "It's over." The man's breathing was ragged, but his eyes were still darting front door, side shelves, the narrow space between tables. He was looking for a way out, but there was none that wouldn't take him past her. She didn't move toward him. Closing the distance now could force him into desperation. Instead, she stayed where she was, body angled just enough to block his path to the weapon. Her hands relaxed at her sides, but ready if he tried anything. The front door creaked open, and the sharp stomp of boots on the worn floor announced the arrival of 2 uniformed officers. Someone must have called in the disturbance early. Maybe one of the high school students with the phone hidden under the table. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers ordered. The man hesitated, his jaw working, but Evelyn saw that the moment he decided, his shoulders slumped slightly, his hands coming up. One officer moved in, cuffing him quickly while the other retrieved the weapon from beneath the desk. Evelyn stepped back, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. The officers exchanged a brief look with her, something between acknowledgement and curiosity, but neither asked a question yet. They had work to do, statements to take. As they led the man out, the room exhaled. Conversations that had been suspended mid-sentence began again in hushed tones. The high school students were whispering furiously to each other. Mr. Callahan was closing his book with deliberate care, and Drew was still standing behind the desk, pale but upright. No one clapped, no one cheered. The weight of what had just happened was too close for celebration, but the air felt different, lighter, relieved. Evelyn glanced once at the door as it swung shut behind the officers, then turned back to the counter. Her hands moved to straighten the stack of returned books she'd left there earlier, as though resuming her day was the most natural thing in the world. Move 3 had ended the threat. Now came the part she preferred, the quiet after the storm. For a long moment after the door closed behind the officers, The library seemed suspended between two states, the tense stillness of what had just happened, and the gradual return to the ordinary rhythm it had known before. It was as if the air itself was recalibrating, testing whether it was safe to move again. Evelyn stood at the counter, her hands resting on the returned books, her posture as steady as it had been in the middle of the confrontation. Around her, the first small sounds began to break the silence. The shuffle of pages as Mr. Callahan reopened his book, a chair creaking as one of the high school students sat back down, the faint rustle of the mother's coat as she rose from her crouch behind the low shelf, holding her child close. The mother's eyes met Evelyn's across the room. No words were exchanged, but there was something in her gaze, a mix of relief, gratitude, and a dawning understanding of what she had just witnessed. She adjusted the child on her hip and slowly made her way toward the exit, pausing only to nod once before stepping into the cold outside air behind the desk. Drew was still pale, his hands resting flat on the counter as if bracing himself. He started, then stopped, the words failing to form. Evelyn didn't press him. She knew the tremor in his voice wasn't from weakness but from the sudden release of tension. "It's done," she said simply, her tone quiet but certain. "You're all right." He nodded, swallowing hard, and reached for the stack of bills that had been on the counter. The sight of them seemed to trigger a fresh wave of realization in him. "You could have." He trailed off again, shaking his head. "I did what needed to be done," Evelyn replied. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer an explanation of how each movement had been measured and intentional. She doubted he wanted the details right now, and she preferred not to speak them aloud. In the far corner, Mr. Callahan closed his book for a second time and stood. His slow, deliberate steps carried him to the counter. He removed his glasses, holding them loosely in one hand. "That was something to see," he said, his voice low. "Not what I expected from." He stopped himself, as though realizing the weight of his own assumption. "Well, thank you." Evelyn gave a small nod. "You're welcome." The high school students were talking now, their voices hushed but charged with energy. She caught fragments. "Did you see?" And she just took it. One of them glanced toward, her eyes wide, before quickly looking away again. She knew those looks. She had seen them before in other lives, other places. People recalibrating, their image of you in real time. The officers' voices drifted in faintly from outside as they loaded the man into the back of the patrol car. The sound of the door slamming shut brought another subtle release in the room. As though confirming that the danger was no longer just out of sight, Evelyn began moving again, collecting the stray books that had been left behind in the sudden pause of events. Each step was measured, her breathing steady, her attention returning to the familiar order of the library. In her mind, the incident was already shifting into the category of finished, not because it lacked weight, but because she had no need to replay it. The decisions had been made in the moment they were needed, and now they were behind her. The donation box, still half full of coins, sat on the counter. She closed the latch and slid it a few inches back from the edge. Drew watched her, still standing in place. "I didn't know," he began. "No," she said, cutting him off gently. "And you don't need to." It was not dismissal, it was protection. The fewer people who knew what she could do, the longer she could keep her life here quiet, untouched by the questions that always followed moments like this. The library's hum began to return, the sound of turning pages, muffled footsteps, and the quiet breathing of a room at ease. But beneath it, something had shifted. The people here would never see her quite the same way again. The officers returned not long after, their boots leaving faint traces of damp on the library's worn carpet. The taller of the two approached the counter, his eyes scanning Evelyn briefly before flicking to Drew. "You both all right?" he asked. His tone was calm, but there was something more behind it, an assessing weight, the kind reserved for people who'd just walked through danger and somehow come out unshaken. "We're fine," Evelyn said, her voice even. She didn't elaborate, didn't mention the steps, the timing, the way she'd angled her body to keep the muzzle down. The details didn't matter to anyone but her. The shorter officer glanced toward the desk where the donation box sat. Your quick thinking kept that from going a very different way. His eyes lingered on her just long enough to make the compliment feel intentional. Then he turned his head slightly, speaking to his partner, though not quietly enough for her not to hear. She handled it like she's done it before. Drew looked from the officers to Evelyn, his brows drawing together. "Done it before?" Evelyn didn't meet his eyes. "I've dealt with situations," she said, and left it at that. The taller officer's mouth curved in a faint, knowing line. "You've got training," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. "It shows." Evelyn gave a small, polite smile that neither confirmed nor denied. "I know how to keep a calm head," she replied. The officers asked for a brief statement, and she gave them the facts as plainly as possible. Man entered, produced weapon, demanded cash. She moved to disarm. Weapon secured. No one injured. She omitted the mechanics of how each part had happened, offering no hint of the precision and control behind it. The taller officer scribbled notes, while the other watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to piece together a story from what she wasn't saying. When they were finished, the shorter one closed his notebook. "We'll need to follow up," he said. "But I think you already know. You just kept this from turning ugly." A faint murmur had been building behind them. The patrons had returned to their books and tables. But the energy was different now, an undercurrent of curiosity and shifting perception. Evelyn could feel their eyes when they thought she wasn't looking. Mr. Callahan stepped forward, the steady thump of his shoes on the carpet sounding louder in the quiet. He stopped just short of the counter. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice formal in a way it hadn't been before. "Whatever it is you know how to do, I'm glad you were here to do it." The high school students were no longer trying to hide their interest. One of them whispered something that made another shake his head in disbelief. In the children's section, the mother had returned, her child holding a small stack of picture books. She gave Evelyn a look that was both searching and grateful, as though she wanted to say more, but knew it wasn't her place. Drew's eyes kept returning to her. He had been working beside her for months, maybe longer, and in all that time he had seen her as just the quiet, steady presence at the front desk. Now there was something else in his gaze, respect, but also the unsettled awareness that he'd been standing next to someone whose life might be much larger than he'd imagined. Evelyn began stacking the returned book she had left earlier, her movements unhurried. The officers took a final glance around the room, then headed for the door, the sound of it closing behind them marking a subtle shift in the air. For the first time since she'd come to this town, Evelyn felt the weight of recognition, not the loud, public kind, but the quiet acknowledgement that passes between people when they see something they weren't supposed to see. It wasn't applause or gratitude. It was sharper than that, more lasting. She didn't welcome it, but she knew she couldn't undo it. Some truths, once glimpsed, stayed in the room. When the officers were gone and the library's quiet began to reassemble itself, Drew lingered behind the counter instead of retreating to the workroom. He straightened a stack of return slips twice, without needing to, glanced at the computer screen, then finally turned toward Evelyn. The weight of what he wanted to ask was written all over him. "Where did you learn to do that?" His voice was low, careful, as if asking too loudly might shatter the fragile return to normalcy. Evelyn didn't look up from the books she was sorting. "Do what? You know what I mean?" Drew's tone wasn't sharp, was something closer to curiosity wrapped in disbelief. "You took a gun out of someone's hand like it was nothing. 3 moves. I've seen videos online of stuff like that, but," he trailed off, shaking his head, "that was real, that was here." She slid a book onto the cart and reached for the next. "I've had some training. Drew gave a short, incredulous laugh that quickly faded under her steady silence. "That wasn't some, that was precise. You knew exactly what you were doing." Evelyn finally looked at him, her expression neutral. "Does it matter?" Drew hesitated. "I guess I'm just trying to understand who I've been working with all this time." She didn't answer right away. The truth was simple enough. He'd been working with the same person all along, but she knew that wasn't the answer he was looking for. People rarely wanted the plain truth when they sensed the story behind it. They wanted the story itself, drawn out into details they could fit into the space their imagination had already built. "Before the library," she said finally, "I had a different job. It required me to know how to handle certain situations." "What kind of job?" The pause that followed was deliberate. She let the quiet stretch just long enough to make it clear she wasn't going to elaborate. "One that's behind me now." Drew studied her for a moment longer, as though deciding whether to push. Then he nodded, a slow acceptance settling in. All right, but his eyes told her he'd keep wondering. From the reading tables, she could feel the occasional glance from patrons who hadn't gone back to their books. Mr. Callahan's head was bent toward his pages again, but his posture wasn't as relaxed as before. The high school students were, still whispering in bursts, stealing looks at her as if expecting her to suddenly pull off a disguise and reveal an entirely different identity. Even the mother in the children's section lingered longer than usual, flipping through a book with one hand while her child stacked blocks on the low table. When she finally moved toward the desk to check out, she hesitated. "You were very calm," she said softly. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone that calm." Evelyn gave a faint smile. "Calm helps." The mother nodded, seeming to understand there wouldn't be more. She took her books and left, the door closing behind her with its familiar weighted sound. Drew returned to his computer, though his occasional glances toward her betrayed his continued curiosity. Evelyn turned back to her cart, sliding another book into place. She knew these questions would linger for a while, circling the edges of conversation in the coming days. Eventually they would fade, replaced by new routines, new small-town stories. But for now, the question Drew had asked would hang in the air, unanswered in the way that mattered most. Evelyn preferred it that way. Some parts of her life were meant to stay where they were, locked in the past, untouched by the slower, quieter world she had chosen. And she would keep it that way for as long as she could. Word travels fast in a small town, even when no one is trying to spread it. By the next morning, the air in the library felt subtly different. Patrons came in with a purpose, but their eyes lingered on Evelyn longer than usual. Conversations that once passed easily over her head now seemed to pause when she entered the room. It wasn't that anyone had the full story, they didn't, but they had enough fragments to stitch something together. Someone had been in here with a gun. Evelyn had stopped him. How, exactly, was a matter of speculation. And speculation was fuel for the quiet gossip that threaded through Main Street like invisible wire. By mid-morning, Mr. Callahan returned with his usual satchel. Instead of heading straight to his corner, he approached the counter. He rested one hand on the polished wood and leaned slightly forward, his voice low. "The police officer who came by last night, he used to be in the service, told me you have the kind of training you don't just pick up in a weekend class." Evelyn didn't flinch. "People say a lot of things." "They do," Callahan agreed, "but I think he meant it as a compliment." He studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod and moved toward his usual table. Later, a man she vaguely recognized from the hardware store came in to return a borrowed book on home repairs. He lingered at the counter after the transaction was done, shifting his weight as though trying to frame a question. "My brother was military police," he said finally. "Said the moves you used, he'd seen them before." His tone made it more observation than inquiry. Evelyn kept her voice neutral. "Maybe your brother and I read the same manual." The truth was more than a manual. The techniques were the product of years of repetition, hours in training rooms, where the mats smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, where every motion was broken down into angles and timing until it became reflex. But that truth belonged to another time, one she didn't offer to the man at the counter. By the afternoon, Drew's restlessness had returned. He'd clearly been replaying the previous day's events in his mind. "So," he said casually, while reshelving returns near her, "you were military, weren't you?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She slid a book onto the shelf, its spine flush with the others, and only then turned to face him. "I was, once." Drew's eyebrows lifted. "That's it? That's all you're gonna say?" "That's all that's needed," she said. For Drew, it was the first confirmed piece of the puzzle. For Evelyn, it was as far as she intended to let the conversation go. The library was not the place for war stories, and she wasn't interested in becoming a local curiosity. Still, the unveiling was happening whether she liked it or not. Patrons who had known her for years without giving her more than a passing thought were beginning to see her differently. Respect had replaced indifference in their greetings. Even those who didn't speak of the incident directly carried it, in the way they moved around her, as if they'd suddenly realized there was more to the quiet librarian than shelves and silence. She recognized the look she'd seen it before in other lives. After moments when her training had surfaced in public, it was a shift that couldn't be reversed. No matter how much she tried to steer the focus back to the ordinary. Evelyn didn't want to be defined by what had happened, but she understood something else now. The moment she'd stepped forward and acted, her anonymity had ended. And in a town like this, once the curtain was pulled back even a fraction, people would always want to see more. By the end of the week, the library felt like the same building, but it wasn't the same room. The tall shelves still cast their familiar shadows. The clock on the wall still ticked at its measured pace. But the way people looked at Evelyn had shifted. It was subtle, no one announced it outright, but she could feel it in every glance that lingered a moment longer than it used to. In the pauses before someone spoke to her, in the way certain patrons now seemed to stand a little straighter when she passed. The high school students, once half distracted and careless in her presence, had become almost formal. They returned books on time, lowered their voices without her having to drift near their table, and even started using bookmarks instead of dog-earing pages. One of them, the tallest boy in the group, murmured a quiet thanks as he handed over a stack of novels. It wasn't for the checkout, it was for something else entirely. Mr. Callahan, who had always kept to himself, now nodded at her each time he arrived, and again when he left, as if acknowledging her role in preserving a space he valued. The mother from the children's section came in twice that week, each time with a calm but deliberate good morning that carried the weight of recognition. She stayed longer than usual, letting her child play while she browsed in silence, though her eyes often found Evelyn at the counter. Even Drew's demeanor had changed. The teasing undercurrent he sometimes carried in his tone had vanished. He was attentive now, listening closely when she gave instructions, asking if she needed help with heavier carts or with shelving in the taller sections. He still wanted to know more. She could see it in the way he watched her sometimes, but there was a new layer of respect under his curiosity. Not all of the changes were welcome. 2 men from the local paper came by unannounced, pretending to browse while clearly trying to strike up a conversation about the incident. Evelyn shut them down politely but firmly, making it clear there would be no interviews. The last thing she wanted was her face in print alongside a headline that would invite questions from beyond this town. Yet even without a newspaper story, word spread. Patrons she barely knew would pause at the desk, looking as though they were trying to reconcile the quiet woman behind the counter with whatever version of the story they'd heard. Some greeted her with a new deference. Others simply watched, as if waiting for her to reveal something else. Evelyn carried on as she always had. She processed returns, answered reference questions, helped children find books on dinosaurs and trains. She kept the plants watered and the displays neat. She never brought up what had happened, and when someone tried, she redirected the conversation back to the business of the library. But she knew the shift was permanent. Once she had been nearly invisible, here seen but not examined, present but unremarkable. Now, even in silence, she occupied more space in people's minds. It wasn't fame, exactly, but it was a form of presence she hadn't asked for. She caught her reflection in the glass of the front door one quiet afternoon and realized something. She hadn't changed her expression, her posture, or her pace. The change wasn't in her, it was in how the world around her had adjusted its focus. The truth was, she preferred the old perception, the one that let her move through her days without anyone wondering who she used to be. But she also knew that respect, once given for the right reasons, had a way of reshaping the ground under your feet. And whether she wanted it or not, the ground here had shifted. In the evenings, when the library was closed and the streets outside had gone quiet, Evelyn found herself thinking about the week in ways she hadn't allowed during the day. Her apartment was as orderly as the library books neatly shelved, surfaces clear, the kettle resting in its usual place by the stove. But lately, the silence there felt different. It didn't carry the same weight of privacy it once had. She would sit by the small table near the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, and replay the events in fragments. Not the danger. She didn't dwell on the moment the gun appeared, nor on the sharp movements of disarming. Those were muscle memory, filed under action taken and completed. What stayed with her instead was the shift that followed, the slow unraveling of anonymity she had protected for years. It wasn't that she disliked respect. Respect was cleaner than curiosity, and in her mind, far better than pity. But the looks she received now were not only respectful, they were searching. People were recalibrating their understanding of her, trying to fit this new image of competence under pressure into the old framework of the quiet librarian. It was an adjustment they might never finish making. She thought about the moment Drew had asked her where she'd learned to do what she did. His voice had carried no malice, only the open, unguarded question of someone who'd been given a glimpse of a closed door and wanted to see the room beyond it. And she thought about how she'd answered briefly, without detail, shutting the door again. It had been the right choice, but it hadn't erased the fact that the door was now visible. The truth was, she had chosen this life precisely because it offered her the luxury of being overlooked. After years of operating in spaces where awareness meant survival, she had wanted the opposite: routine, predictability, an environment where the most urgent interruption might be a printer jam or a misplaced book. The library had given her that, until it hadn't. The incident had reminded her of something she'd almost managed to forget. The skills she carried were not neutral. They had weight, and when called upon, they had the power to change the way others saw her, whether she wanted them to or not. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she had been too careful in keeping that part of her life hidden. Perhaps, if people had known, they would have felt safer around her all along. But she also knew the other side of that truth. Knowledge drew attention, and attention could erode the very quiet she valued. Her gaze drifted to the shelf above her desk, where a single wooden box sat closed. Inside were remnants of her previous life, a folded patch, a small stack of photographs, a laminated ID card whose edges were worn from years in a pocket. She rarely opened it. Tonight, she didn't. The box stayed shut, but the knowledge of its contents lingered. As if acknowledging that it was still there was enough, Evelyn understood that the precedent at the library would fade in the town's memory over time. New stories would take its place. But for some people, drew the mother in the children's section, even Mr. Callahan, the shift would remain. They would remember her not just as the woman who ran the library, but as someone who had stood between danger and the people in the room. She finished her tea and set the cup in the sink. The evening light outside had deepened to blue, the kind that blurred the edges of the buildings across the street. In that half light, the world seemed to hold both her lives at once, the quiet she had chosen, and the readiness she could never entirely put down. By the time a full week had passed, the library's rhythm had mostly returned to its familiar cadence. Books still slid across the counter in steady intervals. The clock's pendulum still marked the hours, and the regulars resumed their habits as if the interruption had been a brief ripple on the surface. But for Evelyn, the quiet that settled over the building each day was no longer quite the same. It was not the unbroken stillness she'd cultivated for years, the kind that wrapped around her like a protective layer. This quiet was aware. It carried the weight of unspoken understanding, the subtle shift that happens when people see something in you they hadn't noticed before. It wasn't invasive, no one was asking for details anymore, but it was present, in the way eyes met, hers a fraction longer, in the way patrons paused before leaving to offer a small nod or a quiet thank you. The changes were easy to spot. The high school students, who once treated the library as little more than a hangout with chairs, now straightened their posture when she walked past. They lowered their voices without needing a look from her. One of them even approached the desk to donate a handful of coins to the box, muttering, "For the library," before quickly retreating. Mr. Callahan remained his usual self, reading at the same table under the arched windows. But when he left each afternoon, his parting nod seemed heavier with meaning. The mother from the children's section often lingered a few extra minutes after checking out, letting her child play quietly as she scanned the shelves. She didn't speak about that afternoon, but the look she gave Evelyn before leaving, steady, respectful, said enough. Even Drew had settled into a new normal. He no longer hovered with unasked questions. Instead, he worked beside her with an attentiveness she hadn't seen before. They spoke about library matters, book orders, and scheduling. But there was an ease in his tone now, as if the unspoken agreement between them to leave certain things alone had made working together simpler. Evelyn herself moved through the days much as she always had, shelving returns, helping patrons find what they needed, keeping the building's order intact. But internally, she felt the difference. The role she had occupied here had expanded. She was no longer only the quiet librarian. She was also the one who had acted when it mattered, something that couldn't be unseen. No matter how many weeks passed, she was careful not to let the change alter her own behavior. She did not take up more space in conversations, did not draw attention to herself. If anything, she doubled down on the routines that had always grounded her: watering the plants at the same hour, brewing her tea at 3, walking the aisles before closing to ensure every book was in its place. But she noticed that these small acts were now watched more closely, appreciated in a way they hadn't been before. On a quiet Thursday evening, after locking up, she stepped outside into the cool air. Main Street was dim, except for the warm glow spilling from the diner across. The way she stood for a moment, keys in hand, listening to the familiar hush of the town at night. The quiet here matched the one inside the library, still present, but no longer empty. She thought of the phrase one of her instructors had used years ago: control the space, and you control the outcome. In the past, she'd applied it: 2 tense rooms and uncertain encounters. Now, she realized it also fit this quieter life. The library had been her space for years, but the incident had changed how others moved within it. They treated it and her with a new kind of regard. Evelyn took a slow breath, slipping the keys into her coat pocket. This quiet might never be the same as before, but it was still hers. Different, yes, infused now with recognition instead of anonymity, but no less steady. And as she walked down the street toward home, she understood she could live with that.